In this session, we'll be talking about how the adoptee is the center of all these adoption decisions, and they're part of the adoption triad together with the adoptive parents and the birth parents, and how they are really the most affected by all the choices that made around them that they really weren't a part of when at birth. And so we are going to dive into that conversation. And you're a partial adoptee. Can you explain what that means and your story of how you grew up in that?
Yeah, so I'll give you a sneak peek because it could be an hour-long conversation. But being a partial adoptee, people often are like, what is that? Because that's not something that they've heard. My mom had me when she was 15. And my birth father was in and out of the picture. He would come and go. He would show up with gifts, but then disappear. And when I turned 3, my mom had met an amazing man and got married at that time. And he legally adopted me. My birth father decided at that point that he didn't want to be a part of the very small picture he was a part of. And so a lot of people equate that to, well, then he's just your stepdad, right? And it's so not that. My birth father isn't a part of the picture. And my dad, who has adopted me, legally went through that process to be a legal guardian, a legal parent in my life. And he is the only dad I've ever known. So within that, I also have 2 half-sisters, and then 5 siblings who are adopted with Down syndrome. And so adoption's always been a huge part of our family dynamic and our conversations, but my adoption in itself was not. And there was a lot of shame surrounding that conversation if I did bring it up, and not so much shame that was portrayed onto me by my parents, but because the conversation wasn't happening, when I did bring it up, it was kind of skirted around. My biological father wasn't a great guy. There was a lot of drug abuse and other abuse and neglect and safety issues there. And so when I did bring him up, the conversation ended fairly quickly just because of the uncomfortable side of it. And so within that, I didn't know until I was about 18 that I had a half brother as well. And so when I found that out, my whole story and my whole life just kind of hit pause, and I was rattled a little bit. I knew I was adopted. I knew my story, but it wasn't part of the everyday conversation. And so I wasn't able to really determine and express what feelings were going on inside of me. And I didn't even really know either because it wasn't being talked about. And so once that happened, when I found out I had a brother, and all of those emotions that I was unaware of started coming up, and the grief and the loss and the different things that were subconscious during my childhood and teen years, I was able to attribute to this one monumental piece of my story. And so that's when I started seeking out counseling and walking through a lot of those emotions that I needed to walk through. So
because of your story and experiencing adoption and talking about it a little differently, being raised in that, how would you recommend that adoptive parents today, when do they talk about adoption with their child?
I would say from birth. Like, it needs to be a conversation. When you're holding that baby in the hospital, talk to them. Start telling them their story. Start telling them about you guys and about the expectant and birth parents, and start integrating that conversation into your everyday lives. They never need to have a moment in their life where there was a monumental marker of, I found out I was adopted when, or at this point, because that is a huge shaper in their identity. And if you have this monumental shakeup, then it's to say that it was a secret in a way. And so it creates a sense of shame and secrecy, and why wasn't I told before now? Because
create some resentment.
Yeah.
And anger.
Absolutely.
Why didn't you tell me this?
Right,
Yeah.
because that's part of their story. It's theirs. It's not, as adoptive parents, you were part of that story, but it's their story. And so sharing that with them from the beginning is essential to them walking through and navigating the journey of adoption.
Yeah, that was one thing that my birth daughter says that her parents did really well, and we talked about this when I was choosing them, and we're having these conversations while I was still pregnant with her, that we wanted her to know from day one who I am in her life, that she was adopted, and those important key puzzle pieces to her life, that we wanted to do that. And she recognizes that now at 15 years old, that they did this well, and I never remember a moment of being told I'm adopted. I just knew. So it was just her normal, and it still is, and it's evidence that having those honest, hard conversations that can be uncomfortable are still important to have in every child's life.
Absolutely. Because even though it might be uncomfortable for you as a parent, that child is trusting you in their everyday lives, and walking across the street. And so having you keep something from them creates in the back of their mind, what else aren't you telling me? And that will go on forever in their life. There will always be that small nugget in the back of their mind that this was kept from them. And so it's a really important thing to tell them from the get-go about their adoption story. And my parents, it was never kept a secret from me, but it wasn't a conversation that continued to happen. And so I think it's a two-part in this scenario. You need to always be open about the adoption story, but you also need to continue that conversation.
Yeah. And by 5, my birth daughter was telling me the very basics of our story of, you were too young to be a mommy, and you chose my parents to take care of me and love me. And so that meant a lot to me, that they were having that conversation even through, like we said, from birth up to 5, and that she was starting to process that.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's really the goal, is just it's her normal, and it's beautiful.
It is beautiful. And a lot of professionals will say that children need to know a basic sense of their story by age 3. They need to know their entire story, the good, the bad, the hard, because there are hard circumstances that surround adoption for a variety of reasons, by age 12. So even things that may have happened that were very difficult to bring their life into the world, whether it be abuse or rape or different things like that, they need to be aware of that by age 12.
Yeah. The story can unfold. Like, you can start with the basics by 5.
Right.
Or, even earlier than that, but by 5 they're grasping that, and it can just keep unfolding, and more details added as the years go on.
Absolutely. You just build on it, and that comes with conversation.
Yeah. So we know it's important to talk about adoption from birth, but how can adoptive parents do that?
Yeah, so just making it part of your everyday normal. If you go to the grocery store and you have different cultures surrounding your children or your child, pick out food, make a dinner that represents their culture. And as you're making it together, just give them bits and pieces of their story. Don't make it a big to-do every time you have that conversation. If you're outside and you see an airplane, you can talk about how, if you flew to go pick them up, talk about that. Did you know mommy and daddy flew on an airplane to meet you for the first time? As you're buckling them up in their car seat, you can have conversations. If there's musically inclined or artistically inclined, talk about that as they're coloring. It doesn't have to be this just big deal every time you talk about it. You can have books that are a big part of sharing their story, and asking them questions so that they can express to you any feelings they may have surrounding their adoption. Another thing would be creating photo albums of birth family, if you're able to do that. If you have photos of the birth mom or the birth father, holding them or without, have a picture on your child's nightstand, or if you have the ability to have access to getting additional pictures of extended family, create a whole album for your child, because it's really important for them to be able to look through that and acknowledge those people in the album and point them out to you, and you have conversations about it.
Yeah, and those identity pieces are really important to your child, of who do I look like and where do I get this talent from. That's the conversations that I have with my birth daughter nearly every visit, and so that's really important that adoptive parents can have that conversation too, and reassuring of all those puzzle pieces that are really important to them.
Yeah, and it's never too late. So if your child is 3, 4, 5, 10, go ahead and have that conversation. It will be a harder conversation to have, just because they don't know at this point, but it's a conversation that really needs to be had, so that going forward you can have more of a level of openness within your communication with each other. And that might be a point when you need to integrate a therapist who is specialized in adoption, because at that point they're trying to figure out, oh my goodness, my parents that I thought were biological to me aren't. So introducing a therapist in that conversation at that point might be a good idea as well.
Right. Okay, so that sounds like that could be traumatic, on top of additional things of adoptees experience anyway.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that and how we can educate ourselves on what that trauma is that children can have from even from birth, and even if they don't realize?
Absolutely. So there's probably something you've heard called the primal wound. That phrase is floating around in the adoption community. But what a lot of people don't realize, especially people who are just getting into the adoption journey, who are preparing to pursue adoption, is that the primal wound is something that all adoptees have. That's where you're separating a biological person from their other biological person, So when you remove that causes instant grief and trauma and loss. And it's subconscious sometimes, and sometimes it comes out not subconscious. So it can come out as little as right away after birth, but it can take years and years to manifest as well. A lot of people think, well, I adopted my child from birth. Why in the world would they be experiencing XYZ? But what they don't think about is the fact that children aren't a blank slate. They've been loved and nurtured by this woman for 40 weeks. They've been creating this bond. This child has smelled her, then felt her movements and heard her voice and been comforted by her in the womb. And so they have created this bond. And so when they're born and they're taken away from the person that they expect to be there to comfort and nurture them, then they are feeling loss. They're feeling grief. And that can happen from birth. People think, well, my child won't experience that. We have a loving home. We have a safe home. We talk about adoption. You can be super open about the conversation, but every child in some way, whether it's initial or when they're 40, will have something tied to their adoption loss. It's something tied to the grief and the trauma, and it may come out in relationships. It may come out in anger or depression or anxiety. It can come out in a variety of ways, but to know that this is a possibility, and for you as a parent to educate. You can't over-educate yourself on adoption, and hearing adoptee voices and perspectives and leaning into all sides of the triad just helps make that journey easier as you navigate that with your child.
Have that understanding, and that it's okay to feel all these things that you're feeling, and that we're here for you and we're a safe place for you.
Yeah, to let them know it's okay to hurt. Yeah. You're not going to hurt us to hurt,
Right.
We're not going to take offense to that.
Right.
We're here
you don't have to be the happy adoptee.
Right, exactly. Exactly, because those emotions can ebb and flow. There's some days I'm so mad at my parents for a lot of the things that I experience, and I am only a partial adoptee compared to adoptees who have the full gamut of experience. And different things that they have to deal with. And so for me, it's an ebb and flow of emotions, and that can happen, on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. I can relate to that as a birth parent, just
Right.
having that ebb and flow of I love adoption or I hate adoption right
Yeah.
now. It's really bittersweet and really hard sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a joyful heartbreak. Leah, how can open adoption relationships benefit the child in processing their adoption and their identity?
Well, research is now showing that it's beneficial for the entire adoption triad.
Yeah.
And so it's beneficial for me as a birth parent in my healing, but it also helps the adoptive parents be able to answer the health questions maybe and have that for their records too. And just overall more satisfying when everybody can come together for the love of this child.
Right.
And so we have found that because she knows me and she has from day one that she can come to me to answer these questions that she has about who do I look like and where do I get this talent from, and answer questions about her birth dad that she doesn't really have anywhere else to go for that.
Yeah.
And so that helps her to have that stability, and she knows that I never didn't want her. I chose adoption for her because I wanted the very best for her, and I wanted to give her more. I wanted her to have a dad who would be present and loving. And so she can process those emotions with me and her parents beside her. She's not alone in it. We're seeing that open adoption tends to help alleviate some of that feelings of abandonment that adoptees can experience. And so again, it gives her that security that I did want her and did love her, and I just wanted the best for her.
Yeah, absolutely. The abandonment part of it, and that can be a feeling when there's shame attached or there's nobody to talk to. So having that support system of you guys and her parents, it shows that y'all are united. It's a united front, which is an amazing thing for adoptees. So what do parents need to know about supporting open adoption relationships with their child?
It's important to remember that even though open adoption is a beautiful, wonderful option for everybody involved, it also doesn't take out the grief, all of the grief that an adoptee can feel. And so you have to navigate that with them and support them in that and help them to feel safe in expressing missing their birth family and wanting to visit. And I've really admired how my daughter's adoptive parents have been completely supportive of what she needs. So even though we've had our adoption agreement plan that was written out during pregnancy, we are now at the point where she's 15 and she has a voice in our adoption.
Yeah.
And so she's starting asking for more. She started to come stay at my house and want to come 2 times
Right.
During a summer, which normally was only 1 time. And so we all are on the same page because we want the best for her. And if she wants more, then that's what she gets. And in the same instance, if there's people she doesn't want to visit with, then we have to give her that space and respect that too.
Right.
And so it's important to parents to remember to follow their lead, especially as they grow.
Right. And it's not a competition. I think a lot of people can get defensive a little bit, or there might be some jealousy there, and to understand, like, it's not a competition. And something I think you have said before is people wonder how you can love 2 moms or 2 dads if the birth father is involved as well. And you equate it to if you have a step parent that you love dearly.
Yeah.
And that step parent relationship and that biological parent relationship can be just as fruitful both ways and have a love for both of them. Not to say that it's co-parenting in adoption, because that is a different aspect, but there's enough love there to not be a competition and to have everybody involved.
Yeah, and it's important for the adoptive, I feel like especially the adoptive mom and the birth mom, to realize, like, we have our own different roles in this child's life, and they both are complex and they're both different, and I respect that about them. And she is completely her parent, and I'm completely a separate entity of her and piece of her identity, and that's okay. And I grew up with a stepmom and a mom, and I've known them my whole life. And so that's the closest thing I have to relate to how my daughter feels, of feeling in the middle sometimes, and loving both and wanting to be with both, but they both offer different pieces of who I am, and one is biological and one is completely different, and how she raised me, and they offer different perspectives and they offer different advice and they have different personalities, and that's wonderful. It's extra that I got to experience, and that's something that our daughter has too in the center.
Yeah, it's just more people to love your child.
Exactly.
Which is never a bad thing.
No.
You know?
Not when it's done well.
Yeah, exactly. We know open adoption is often the best thing for the child, but it comes with its own measure of complexities and hard emotions. Can you share some of the things that adoptive parents might expect?
Yes, the main thing to remember is just because your child is having a tantrum or some grief or sadness, it doesn't mean that open adoption is bad. Don't look for an excuse to close it down with that relationship with the birth parent. It's not an excuse to do that. This is your chance to be supportive and be with them to process through all those hardships that they will experience. I have found in our 15 years of open adoption that especially after visits, it would really trigger that primal wound and that separation that my daughter would feel, and her parents were great about supporting her through that and still encouraging her to have a relationship with me, and that safe place that she can have us both, and just acknowledging that it's okay to hurt.
Yeah, I've heard, many adoptees share or birth parents share, like that day after or those 2 days after can just be really heavy and hard. Is that something y'all experience?
Yes, and I think as she gets older, it almost gets a little bit worse because we're even more aware, especially her. I know that she is more aware, and that is really hard as a birth parent to know that she's hurting, and it was my choice that caused that, even if I did want the best for her. And so this year has been really beautiful because she's opened up even more to me, and so we've spent hours just texting back and forth about talking about our feelings and how we miss each other, but we still love her parents, and we thank God for our story, but it still doesn't negate all the hardships too. But it's just giving us it's a bonding experience for us too, that we can walk through that grief together.
And I'm sure for you, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it can trigger that separation experience again for you too.
Yes, especially because we tend to have some longer visits now as she's older, and so for a little bit she becomes part of my family with our 5 kids and my husband in my house or on a trip, and so she starts feeling this is what my life could be like, and I start feeling that too, and so it really just kind of rips open that wound a little more of not of just missing her in that daily presence, and that really is hard.
And it's not to say that adoption's a bad thing when that happens. We all have to navigate different difficulties in our life, and that's just one difficulty that is part of y'all's story. And it's a beautiful story, but there's different aspects that can be hard with adoption, and that's just one of them.
I love how her parents, I always worry of overstepping my boundaries as the birth parent, and I worry, oh no, if she's crying after our visits for the half of the day after I drop her off, are they going to close it because of that, or are they going to limit it? And I love that they're like, no, I know this is important to her, and she needs this, even if it is really hard when she comes home, she needs this. And I love that they respect that for her.
It's part of her processing. And I think the adoptive parents probably know that because you have such a strong relationship that you've built along the way of trust and just building that communication. And so they know you're a safe place for her to go to. They know if they're having an issue with her or something that's come up that she's getting in trouble for or anything like that, that they can talk to you and you'll support them no matter what, and vice versa.
Fully support them as parents, and I just want to be, truly a support role in their life, just like a special aunt would be, or another mentor kind of person in their life. And I think that's a lot of things that scare hopeful adoptive parents, is they're like, oh no, is it going to be a co-parenting relationship? I know we've talked about that a little here and there throughout the series, but it truly isn't. It's a relationship that is
a beautiful example of redemption of the story, and then you're able to be a part of your child's life, and she's able to be a part of your life, but they're the main parents in this role.
Right.
So.
Well, thank you so much, Mallory, for sharing your experiences being an adoptee and how we can better focus our mindset towards what their experience is and how we can help them.
Absolutely. It was a privilege to be able to share a small piece of my story with you guys.